So your new book has just come out fairly recently, and it's called Human Wrongs.
It is indeed.
It's a rather clever play on words.
Oh, thanks very much.
I think, yeah. From obviously human rights, which is
indeed
what it's all about.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
This year is the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration. So that's what prompted me to write it.
Oh, wow.
But you wouldn't necessarily know that because it's not really being reported in the media, because why would people in power want you to know that you have rights?
Interesting. And from your book, that's kind of been the case almost since the beginning. There was very little mention of it in Parliament when it came in 1948, is that right?
That's right. It's a bit of a strange document in a way, because the people that championed it at the time made it quite clear that this was not going to be a legally binding treaty where you could appeal to international courts of law or domestic courts of law. So you think, well, what's the point of it then? But within the document it says that if people are not to be compelled to overthrow their governments, they should have some minimal rights. So in a way it's kind of a tokenistic gesture just to protect elite interests. But there's a bit of a paradox because it was rather, swept under the carpet. So it's a rather strange historical situation. But in the 1970s, the document was incorporated into law under the Convention on Civil and Political Rights. So with what's happening today, whether it's for example, the British Medical Journal said that because of austerity in the last 10 years, 120,000 people in this country have died because of the cuts. So people who have found their social security or care being taken away could appeal to this document and say this is clearly a violation of the Universal Declaration. But technically the option is there, but most people don't know about it, and there's no enforcement mechanism. So if people were to have more awareness of their rights, and if there was political pressure to put more teeth into it, to make governments abide by the treaty, then I think it could be a really important guarantor of civil and political rights.
Amazing.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I think we're both speechless because this is such an important subject, and so, like Brexit, so many of us actually are aware of what's even happening out there. What specifically, if you don't mind me asking, what specifically, other than the 70-year treaty, the anniversary of it rather, got you to be so heavily involved on an emotional level with this subject?
I suppose it's seeing the kind of suffering that people in power can induce on a society just by simply having financial policies or cultural policies, and that can have serious effects on people. So if you care about the society and the culture, then I think it's important to ask what's going on and what can be done to change that.
And for you personally then?
Well, it's just a sense of caring, I suppose.
Compassion.
I mean, one of the things that comes out time and time again is the fact that, it's the marginalised people in society that are not getting a fair share of the cake, and that seems that, whether it's, I suppose women still to a degree, minorities of various sorts, handicapped people, a whole range of people at the bottom end that don't seem to have actually benefited, or in fact have actually, their situation seems to have actually deteriorated over the last few decades, and this doesn't really seem to have had much effect in rectifying that.
That's right. So there are 30 articles in the Universal Declaration, and they cover everything from the right to life and the right not to be a slave and so on, all the way to more cultural and civil and political issues, such as the right to decent work and fair pay and so on. And if you look at the statistics for the UK, and particularly compare it to some of the more developed countries in Europe, you see that on issues of maternal mortality and infant mortality, life expectancy, child well-being, Britain is really at the bottom. It's like a lot of Eastern European ex-Soviet countries in that way, and these are deliberate political decisions. It was a decision of the Tory government in the 70s that they wanted to take away some state controls over the economy. It was called the New Conservatism. So you suddenly had this neoliberal agenda put into overdrive, where it was everybody for themselves, and you had cutbacks to social welfare and so on. And this had very serious consequences, particularly, as you said, for people sort of at the bottom, the most vulnerable. And in the last decade alone, Britain has been condemned at least 16 times by the United Nations, different agencies, precisely for some of these issues. So different agencies have condemned, for example, what was called the bedroom tax, which was essentially a tax on disabled people with an extra bedroom that apparently they weren't using. In reality, many were. Perhaps they had to have a carer staying there or some medical equipment, and they were not getting the housing benefit they needed, and many had to move out, and that caused a lot of strain and hardship. And there are other issues like the massive surveillance state that we've got now, where everything we do and say on a digital communication is recorded and put into a massive database. That's been also condemned by other agencies of the UN. And you know, on it goes.
It's interesting. I think that's one of the things that surprised me, that we do regard ourselves in Britain as being we're obviously a very wealthy nation compared to most parts of the world. And yet, by so many of these measures, we're sort of the bottom of the table in terms of, you know, these sort of welfare issues.
Yeah, that's because the wealth goes into so few pockets.
Seems to be the main problem there. Yeah.
And they're not spending it by investing in society. It's offshore in tax havens, or it's put into these obscure money markets where people make money from money. We were talking earlier about Brexit, and that's going to be one of the big exports of the new post-Brexit economy, is financial services, which just means, you know, making money from money and blowing more bubbles.
Absolutely, yeah, interesting.
Wow, do you know what? You're really getting me to think here. You know, I really don't even know that I know now whether there's 30 articles in the human rights. I had no idea, and I wonder how many of our listeners actually have any idea. Were we taught this at school? I grew up in Holland, so I would have had a different schooling, but I know I'd never heard. I heard of human rights, but I never heard of the 30 rights that have been put down as a declaration for us all to supposedly adhere to. So if we don't know, how can we hold people accountable?
Yeah, that's partly what motivates me to try and raise awareness about it.
Look, so as Anne pointed out, there are 30 articles to the declaration, which I had no idea about, and you obviously hadn't. So I think it's a bit of a failing in all our education systems. So actually, reading your book's been very interesting, because not only has it told me a lot about where it isn't working, but the fact, you know, what those rights are and how it all hangs together. And what I like about this book, Tim, is you as always, it's immaculately researched. I think a mark of your writing is you seem to put an awful lot of effort into very, very detailed and comprehensive research. And you basically take each of those human rights one by one and told us what they are, and then told us a good example of where it isn't happening, kind of thing, which I thought was a very clever way of doing it.
Oh, thanks very much. Well, I thought it would make a more interesting read to quote from the specific article, like everyone has the right to be free from torture, for example, and then write a chapter showing how people are tortured on British territory.
Interesting. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that? Because I think most people would say, no, in this day and age, nobody in Britain is tortured. But
yeah, in the case of Diego Garcia, it's an island archipelago, and Britain essentially kicked the population off. They were technically British citizens, and this was in the late 60s, 70s. They expelled them to Mauritius and London and other places, so that the United States could put a military base there, and the US uses it for refueling when it bombs Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, but it's also been used as what they call a black site for torture. So alleged suspects in the so-called war on terrorism have been kidnapped and taken to the island and tortured, and the United Nations has written a report about Britain's role in this. So the idea that we're a civilized nation that doesn't do torture when we're directly involved in allowing the US to exploit part of what's supposed to be our territory to torture people is a total violation of the Declaration. And that's just one really blatant example. There are more subtle examples, such as everyone has the right to life. Well, what about the pollution, where the government, whichever government's in power, refuse to have really strict regulations on air quality? And according to very serious data, I think it's the Royal College, they have estimated that about, I think it's 40,000 people a year die from air pollution. It shortens people's lives and it worsens asthma, things like that. So somebody who's affected by air quality technically could cite the Declaration and say, look, this is killing me, I have a right to life. But if they don't know about it, and if there's no enforcement mechanism, then it's not possible to do that.
Which kind of comes back to what we were saying at the beginning. Actually, education is perhaps one of the ways that this might start to change, do you think? Absolutely, but I think I mentioned earlier, it's not in the interests of people that have power to let you know that you have rights. You're supposed to believe that you're in the best civilization there's ever been and it can't get any better, and there's no alternative to austerity. It's just one of those unfortunate things, and shut up and get on with it. So that's the mental paradigm in which we're kept, and that's why, despite it being the 70th anniversary, we've heard very little about it.
Wow, yeah. I'm really thinking, I'm going to ask a really ignorant question, because I know that if I was listening to this, I would have this question and I would not know, I would want to know the answer is, who wrote these 30 articles and why therefore do they hold sway?
Yeah, these were written by lawyers of the post-Second World War period who were connected to the governments at the time of the UK, the US especially, Australia and I think Canada. Those were the main drafters, the main framers of it. And it's, as I said, a rather strange article in the sense that it gives you the appearance of these rights, and yet it had no enforcement mechanism. And it also makes clear in the Declaration that it's so that people don't have, they're not compelled to overthrow their governments. So it's possibly it was drafted at the time to be used as an ideological weapon against the Soviet Union, for example, to say, look at how badly the Soviets treat their publics. That's why the Soviet Union never recognized it. But Britain for a long time was allied to apartheid South Africa, and the apartheid South Africa never recognized it either, because that would mean giving rights to black South Africans. So Britain's allies didn't recognize it either. Interesting, isn't it? Yeah, so many vested interests in these things, really. Not all, not everything is quite as obvious on the surface as you think it is.
Yeah, I'm listening to the word intention, right? So the intention with which it was created wasn't necessarily to do good, but or to support humanity, but actually to show who isn't. Does that make sense?
I think so, but the people, when you have power, it's very difficult to say to yourself, I'm an evil person doing wrong. You think that you have power and responsibility, and what you're doing is right. So if somebody points out your hypocrisy and contradictions, it just doesn't enter your head. You can't hear it. So I'm sure the people that wrote it thought they were doing a wonderful thing. But given the nature of how power works, it's obviously, it's something that other people should adhere to, not us.
So what is the solution then, Tim? What do you think we should do about this?
Oh, I think it requires education and commitment to political change.